Hello everyone, I would like to come in again to give instructions on the interpretation. On the bottom half of your screen, you will be able to see a globe icon. Please click on that and select the language in which you will be speaking. This is for the panelists, and for the attendees, please select the language in which you would prefer to listen in. If you are fluent in both Dari and English, then you can keep the settings as is. We have interpretation available from English to Dari and then from Dari to English. Another instruction will be that please send in your question and answer questions in the Q&A box that you will see at the bottom of your screen. There will be a lot of chat introductions in the chat box, which is why we will not be able to take all the questions that are put in the chat box. That's why please direct all your questions in the Q&A bar. Apart from these instructions, please maintain decorum. Please keep all your questions, send it in writing. We will have space for question and answers towards the end. Please maintain respect and kindness throughout the session. This session is being recorded and will be available later on for anybody who has any connectivity issues. Thank you very much, and I would hand it over to Ms. Rasuli to take it forward.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who has joined us from across the world. I'm Farzan Rasuli. I'm a member of FARAGEER, an Afghan women rights activist, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today for this webinar, which is titled Between Oppression and Abandonment: How Afghan Women Are Losing Support and Space. It's organized as part of the Women-led Global Forum for Afghanistan, and it's also organized jointly with FARAGEER. Distinguished colleagues and friends, after Taliban returned to power, humanitarian aid fell from almost 3.8 billion in 2022 to just 767 million in 2025. It was reported by Reuters. And the CSIS reported in 2023 that the UK reduced its aid by 76% and Germany by 93%, while OCHA has recently warned that the US funding suspensions have left millions without support. These cuts have forced the closure of hundreds of health facilities, halted protection programs for women and girls, crippled women-led and civil society organizations, the very groups sustaining Afghan community under immense pressure. The recent ALNAP Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, it also confirms that local actors have borne the worst of these reductions. For women human rights defenders, this means greater danger, fewer lifelines, and fading hope. This crisis is not only about money, it's about survival, and reversing these cuts and investing again in Afghan civil society, especially women-led organizations, is essential. Today's panel will explore how this funding crisis is affecting Afghan women and civil society, and most importantly, how can we collectively work to sustain these movements and organizations and ensure they are not left behind. With that, it is my honor to begin our webinar by inviting Seema Ghani, a leading women's rights advocate from inside Afghanistan, to deliver her opening remarks. Seema Ghani is a women's rights activist and a humanitarian who has held senior government roles in Afghanistan since 2002, including Director General for Budget and Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Affairs. And she's also worked with PwC in London, and currently she lives in Afghanistan, consulting for national and international organizations. Seema, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Farzan Jan. A very good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I assume nowhere is evening other than Afghanistan. I was so looking forward to this, introduction or talk or the opening. Unfortunately, it's coming at a time where we've just had a couple of really major, horrible explosions inside Kabul, and not very far from where I reside. And I'm getting calls, I'm calling others, and I had some notes with me to talk about, but the only thing that I think of is that because it happens, this explode, these bombs probably, it's not just an ordinary explosion, because they happen during the daytime. It makes me think that majority of the victims are again women and children. No matter what happens, in our country, women and children are always the primary targets, the primary victims. We have all sorts of crises. It hasn't just been conflict. We have droughts in the country, we have floods in the country, we have earthquakes, and now bombardments have started. So with all of these, when women and children, and particularly girls who usually stay at home and have been under home arrest by the current regime, are being affected, what are we doing about it? I don't think we're actually doing enough. Maybe we are sort of, helpless, but, and becoming hopeless with all the other crises across the world. I also contribute to some of the African countries, and to Gaza, and naturally not to Ukraine, because there's plenty of help, I think, coming from Europe and America and elsewhere to them. But we all try to help each other. Humanity is about helping each other and holding hands. But in this process, I wonder if we're actually forgetting about some of the countries that are quieter, that are voiceless, like women and girls in Afghanistan, because they can't raise their voice as much as they used to be able to. And there's this misunderstanding by a lot, including I've actually heard this time and time again within the humanitarian organizations, usually abroad, that there's peace in Afghanistan, there's no war. What we forget is the lack of war does not bring peace. It's not secure. It's not a country where we live securely. It's not a country where we live peacefully. We have to distinguish this. And this is why I think, a lot of our, I suppose, counterparts and others in the West feel that Afghanistan is probably not a priority for help and support. And that's why the reductions in aid. I think, USAID, as Farouzan Jan also referred to it, USAID's action was very interesting at the beginning of the year. It wasn't just Afghanistan, of course, but it affects us because, USAID was one of the biggest donors to the NGO. One of the NGOs, I volunteer with 2 NGOs, and one of them is working in reproductive health and rights areas. And we were affected big time. We had clinics, family health homes, we call them, small, units across the country, in districts and villages where there were no other clinics built. Why? Because the last 20 years, because of the war, because Taliban did not allow clinics to be built, because of corruption that happened the last 20 years, and all that you can imagine, for all different types of reasons. A large part of the country needs access to health. Currently, bigger population, probably around 70–80% of the population of the country, need to walk 1 hour or travel for 1 hour to get to a health center. And yet with the USAID cuts, some of those clinics had to be closed. Unfortunately, the only hope, and I've been witness to some of these clinics where, interestingly enough, some women use it as little resource centers, a little place where they can go to. If one woman in a family needs some kind of a health support, other members of the family come with them because they don't have anywhere else to go. They're completely, shops are shut to them, clinics, hospitals, parks, everything is shut. There's nowhere else to go. So just to get out of the house, at least they can, a few of them, get together and go to one of these family health centers. And unfortunately, even that is close to them. We're actually getting from, bad to worse. A small number of girls who had lost education, they managed to get into these scholarships. America has also stopped that. I don't mean to be sort of specifically talking or targeting America, but that's sort of the examples that come up, certain scholarships that, girls were hoping for. About 208, I think the figure, if I'm not mistaken, scholarships that girls would have Otherwise, either in person or online would have attended. They've all shut down to them, while they don't have access to schools and universities inside the country. So there's no education, no work, no public space, not able to raise their voice, more mental health issues, increased poverty, more, let's not forget, domestic violence. When men are under pressure outside, they come home and they take it out on women. But then there is no support to try to, attend somewhere, a center, a group of, meet a group of other women, a resource center or something to be able to manage, their crisis. Even, programs or the big funds such as the Special Trust Fund, I was looking at some figures the other day. Out of the projects that STFA is implementing in Afghanistan, 53% are addressed towards men and 47% to women. So it may not be intentional, but unintentionally, instead of increasing funds for women and girls, we're actually decreasing it. Let me stop here and give it to back to Frozen John and the rest of the team, and we'll come back and talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seema Jan, for those insightful and moving opening remarks. Now, to better understand the current landscape and the daily realities of Afghan women under the Taliban rule, I now invite Wajma Furo, the Executive Director of the Women and Peace Studies Organization. I would not read the whole bio, as you can already see it on the screen in the Zoom. So I would like to invite her to share her perspective on the current context in Afghanistan. Wajma Jan, the floor is over to you.
Thank you so much. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, actually, to colleagues in Afghanistan. And it's so good to see within the chat. I saw many of my colleagues from Afghanistan. So I'm very, very grateful that despite the connectivity challenge, despite all the pressures and tensions these days, this escalation of violence between the Taliban and the Pakistani army, in all of that, our colleagues and women and men from Afghanistan are joining us on this important conversation, particularly about, and as the title suggests, like the people inside Afghanistan, the women and the communities are very much kind of sandwiched between two, as we say in Farsi as well, that between a rock and a hard, because what's happening is that on one side, there's a lot of restrictions that has actually paralyzed life, particularly for women, but on the other hand as well, the international aid, and Seema Jan also mentioned about this lack of attention for Afghanistan and many other, competing interests in the work. And I have a quick PowerPoint to share some of the things that my colleagues have shared from Afghanistan and some figures from different donors. These figures might not be very much updated, but this is what we have so far. So basically, just to get a landscape of where we are. Everybody knows that the Taliban have been, since 2021, they started actually a sweeping bans on women's access to education, employment, health, public participation, you name it. And in December 2022, they banned women organizations from working and women from working in these NGOs. So it's both, actually, women organizations being able to do work for women and also women working in the NGOs. But that actually, the ban also extended to the UN agencies, and hopefully we will hear more from Suzanne about how the UN has been managing that. But the ban has very much became forcefully enforced following the Vice and Virtue law that came into effect in 2024. And as Frozen John mentioned, Afghanistan has a very severe humanitarian crisis right now. And as we are speaking, the numbers that we have been hearing, that that's like there's a huge funding gap, like 30% is funded, but they have a funding gap of up to 70%. But what's also important to understand that within this humanitarian crisis, the women of Afghanistan have not just sat down to become, to receive handouts from aid. They also do many things that we don't hear about, that we don't know about. New York Times doesn't report about it, like you don't hear in Guardian, because of the security perspective, but also because of the lack of attention on Afghan women. So the women groups and women organization, and I really deliberately want to mention the women-led organization and women-led groups, because there are many informal groups right now in Afghanistan who are doing many things on the ground, that they are not registered, they are not a formal institution, but they are actually creating so many different activities for women. And many of them, like 40% of them had lost, funding just earlier April this year. And at the same time, you have the humanitarian crisis. Women are bearing the heaviest brunt, but the aid delivery to women is also very much handicapped, because women are not in the aid delivery sector. And as we saw very much in the recent earthquake in September in Kunar province, where, for example, our colleagues who are also here, they have been telling us that women were dying under the rubbles because the man in the family did not allow another man to touch her, to take her out of the rubbles. And how many women who were pregnant had lost their lives because of the lack of female doctors. But still, we saw that, the number of, women-led initiatives that still happened, and women traveled even from other provinces, including Nangarhar, to go to Kunar to support them. So, a snapshot of numbers, this is very kind of overwhelming, but, you can look at those numbers on your own. But what we see among all of this is that much of this funding, that of course US was the biggest funder since 2021, United States has provided some $3.5 billion to Afghanistan as per FARAGEER. That came as part of humanitarian and development, but it's also very much important that this money did not come to Afghans. This was very much provided to contractors as well. So that's a complete different conversation. European Union, this is not including the European countries, but the Union, have pledged 161 million, for example. OCHA, which is like the biggest kind of umbrella for the AHF, the Afghanistan Humanitarian Fund, for example, is saying that some 20% of their funding went to national organizations. And the rest, and within that national organizations, how much of it went to women organization, I'll tell you that later. And the US funding cuts is very much severe, because from what we are hearing is that the mother's mortality rate, which are preventable in Afghanistan, it's going to 1,000, over 1,000 actually. And as I mentioned, AHF, which is like the largest, humanitarian fund for the NGOs, like 21% has gone to the local organization, but that does not include the women organizations, because there might be 1 or 2 or 3, women organizations. And we'll hear more about the UN Women funding, but based on what I'm hearing is that some 4.5 million last year, and 7.36 million by WPHF. But much of it went to women organizations and women activities outside Afghanistan. It did not go to women organizations in Afghanistan. And the reason we are kind of talking about that distinction, the importance of the women-led organizations and women-led initiatives inside Afghanistan, is the fact that they are indispensable, and at the same time they are the only sources of women's mobilization in Afghanistan. No matter how much of conferences and investigative mechanisms and all these different international conferences and events we have outside Afghanistan, but if we do not have institutions of women-led or support women-led groups inside Afghanistan, even Richard is here, like how would they be able to even collect that information is a major question. So from what we see, that less than 1% of the funding that came from 2021 until now for 4 years went to women-led organization. And that is the, a very like telling story that less than 1% women went to women organization. Operational restrictions, the Taliban do not allow women organizations to, operate. They had to change their names. They had to remove all the women from their boards, from their director level positions. They had to remove women from their, staffing. So the restrictions is very much, but the compliance burden is also very high. Like the compliance with the, that the banking blocks, but also the Afghanistan is in the terror sanctions group, so the organization's inability to receive any funding, and also for smaller organizations, for local groups, the compliance is very overwhelming. When we get 130 page of application for an organization that can hardly speak English, the staff, of course, you can understand how difficult it is. And of course, women-led organizations, for safety purposes, but also for their privacy purposes, they use informal structures like hawalas, and we spent a lot of money in hawalas that go through different channels. You send money to Dubai, from Dubai to Kabul, and all that exchange rate that happens during the way is also very much it's just a waste of all this funding that until it reaches to Afghanistan. And I don't need to.
Thank you, Wajmajan. If you can shrink it a bit,
sure.
We are running out of time, so if you can summarize.
Sure. I don't need to convince this group that why do we need women organizations and women-led initiatives, because they are the indispensable, but at the same time, they are the only spaces and platforms for women activism and women mobilization. So it's not just about NGOs and just projects. It's actually about the space. And they are the only spaces that we have in Afghanistan. We have the macro gap that I talked about, but then less than 1% of this money goes to women organization. I have a number of, what needs to happen on the group, from the women that I have been talking to. So Frozanjan, maybe I can come to that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wajmajan, for that powerful overview of the current context. Given that we are a bit behind the schedule, I would request the speakers to please stick to 5-6 minutes so that we can hear from all of you, and we can also have a Q&A session where our audience can ask their questions. Next, we are honored to hear directly from a courageous Afghan women rights activist joining us from inside Afghanistan, who will share her lived experience and testimony about the realities faced by women on the ground. So I would call on our sister to speak and talk about the realities from inside Afghanistan.
Thank you, Frozanjan, for having me. Hi, everyone. Good evening. And I would like to say that I'm a women's human rights defender working with a local organization in Afghanistan. And besides being a WHRD, today I also want to speak to you as a young girl living here inside Afghanistan, someone who witnesses every single day how our lives, our dreams, our dignity are being squeezed between two painful realities, between oppression and abandonment. As a woman and a girl living in Afghanistan, for us, oppression is not just a word. It's a lived experience. The locked classrooms that we see every day, the offices that we cannot enter, the checkpoints that they question our presence every single time when we go outside, the silence that greets our demands, and the abandonment that hurts the most. It's when the world that once stood with us slowly steps back, and when the promises of that we will not forget Afghan women, it fades quietly into diplomacy and shifting priorities. Every Afghan woman today lives in between fear and courage, between losing what we had once and refusing to give up what still matters. We're still navigating new forms of invisibility. Some of us can no longer work. Others are just hiding our activism behind closed doors. And many of our brightest minds, they have been pushed into exile. And yet we're still continuing to hold our communities together. While oppression is still visible, abandonment is quieter, but it's equally damaging. As a young girl who's quite new in the civic space, I'm witnessing how every day the gender gap in civic spaces it's increasing and how our eraser and the silence it's becoming very normalized. As highlighted by a report of UN Women, by 70 to 80s of women are being erased from meetings and conferences. Even from those discussions which are about women of groups and organizations. And many of these women, they're about to diminish due to lack of support and resources. Today, I would like to share some of the alarming updates that I witness as someone working in the civic space with you. Donor fundings for women-led organizations have drastically declined. International engagement has become limited to humanitarian responses. They're neglecting women's rights and leadership. Many local women organizations that once provided education, counseling, and advocacy have closed due to lack of financial or political support. The gender gap in civic space is deeply shocking. Many of the donors, they prefer working with male organizations because they find them easy to work with as partners. This has created a dangerous vacuum for Afghan women because they're left to resist alone. Now, the international community's withdrawal didn't only take away funding, it took away protection, solidarity, and global attention from Afghan women. When the donors pulled out, they didn't just end the projects, they ended safe spaces, learning opportunities, and hope. So the disengagement of international actors has sent a painful message that Afghan women's rights are negotiable and they're no longer a priority. The basic human rights, which are universal for other women around the globe, are too much for Afghan women to ask for. Let me convey the message of women organizations operating inside Afghanistan with you. Without sustained support, the decades of progress made in women's education, participation, and leadership, they will all be permanently lost. We appreciate your messages, we appreciate the reports, the statements, but we need you to translate your support into action by standing with us, by providing financial and diplomatic support. We call on you to provide direct, flexible, and long-term funding to women-led and women-focused organizations inside Afghanistan. Continuous political engagement that includes women voices at every level. Protection mechanisms for women human rights defenders. Long-term partnership that prioritize empowerment over charity. We don't ask for sympathy, we're asking for solidarity. We don't need rescuing, we need recognition and resources to continue leading our own solution. We are speaking, but from places where the world no longer looks. The least the international community can do is just listen, engage, and trust the Afghan women to decide what works best for their communities and enable us to deliver to our communities. Afghan women have rebuilt after war, after the displacement, after every betrayal, and we will rebuild again. Even between oppression and abandonment, we're choosing resistance and resilience. Hope is not lost here. It just needs to be created and seen again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your bravery, our dear sister, and giving voice to so many who cannot speak. I would now ask Richard Bennett, who has served as UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan since 2022. Richard, your office has studied these dynamics closely. How do you see the landscape of funding changing? And what does this mean for Afghan women's rights movements and their struggle for global justice? What are your recommendations to Afghan women, international partners, and the donors? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frozan Jan. It's an honor to be a member of this very important panel. And, in a way, I think, I just want to pay tribute to the previous very eloquent speakers. First of all, to also to note what our first speaker, Seema Ghani, said about that your minds maybe are on other issues. We have also been following the border violence, and I've been seeing about the explosions in Kabul as well today. The Taliban said it was a petrol tanker that exploded. I don't know if that's true, but what we're very concerned about is the civilian casualties. And of course, usually these are women and children who are the casualties, as the point was made earlier. And in terms of what I need to recommend, Frozan Jan, I am so impressed and in awe of the previous speaker, a young woman activist from Afghanistan, that I feel I hardly need to add anything to what she has recommended, but simply stand in solidarity and endorse what she has just shared with us. Let me say that, yes, I have done some study into the situation of reductions in funding for programs and aid in Afghanistan. It is not, I want to say that it's not an in-depth study, but we did some work on this for a report that my team and I have written, and I will be presenting at the General Assembly on October 30th, just over 2 weeks from now. So I'll go into those things a little bit, but I'd also like to thank Wajmajan for the work that you've done to provide an overview of the situation. And having looked into it a little bit myself, it's so difficult actually to actually find what is the current funding. How has it changed from last year? Really difficult to pin down. And I met, I'm not based in the UK, but I'm in London today. And this morning I had a meeting with the UK Foreign Office, FCDO. And they were telling me, and this is maybe contrary to what we're hearing from other sources, that their funding has barely reduced this year. That this year it was, and I think these are the figures, but I'm just going by memory, with 151 million pounds. And it was 171 last year, and that they think they're still the second biggest donor behind the EU. Now, I've seen other data that is not the same as that. So it's really difficult to find accurate data, and I really admire you, Wajma, for the work that you've done. I would also like to, just moving on to the other comments, to stress that recent funding cuts come after already a dramatic decrease in international aid and assistance in Afghanistan since the Taliban took power. And many groups have already been struggling for 4 years with dwindling resources. And this comes on top of the increasingly restrictive environment for civil society organizations, and especially WHRDs, under the Taliban. The recent cuts are unfortunately very likely to be long-term due to a change in strategy by states. And I comment here a little bit on what Seema Ghani said. There is a kind of competition with other crises around the world. But I think it's more than that. I think it's that many of these donor states have decided to put more money into defense. And this has come also after pressure from the US, and particularly for the other NATO members. They've increased their defense budgets. And what is the cost? They've cut their aid budgets to pay for the defense budgets. And that's why it's probably long term as well. So I think it's really important that these donors are made aware not just of the broad and very real impacts that these cuts have for people on the ground, but also how they undermine the donors' own broader efforts to help towards a safe, stable, and secure Afghanistan. They are Yeah, we have a couple of sayings in English. Often I hear Farsi sayings. Shooting themselves in the foot is one that comes to mind. Or cutting off their nose to spite their face is another one that sometimes is used. Look, I think when I put together this this part of this report, we sought input from many sources inside and outside Afghanistan, working in diverse fields, and many were women-led organizations. The overall picture is very clear. All were suffering as a result of funding cuts this year, and all expressed that the long-term sustainability of their work is is in jeopardy. And the effects, as has been said already by Wajmajan, is especially felt by smaller grassroots organizations who often lack the core funding and the access to diverse funding sources. Many organizations report that they've been forced to suspend or terminate key projects, lay off staff, reduce salaries, or ask employees to work without pay. And as has been said by the previous speaker, despite the dire situation, Afghan organizations, especially women-led, have demonstrated notable resilience. They've adopted innovative strategies to sustain their work. And we heard about many efforts to implement low-cost community initiatives, such as by strengthening coordination with local and traditional leaders, transitioning to remote or hybrid models, and diversifying donors and seeking even smaller grants. And while these adaptive measures showcase the commitment of Afghan civil society, they're not a sustainable long-term solution, and often create additional bureaucratic and other resource burdens. So maybe I'll just come to a few recommendations of my own. It's clear that there needs to be a significant increase in financial support for Afghan-led civil society organizations, and particularly women-led. And as the Special Rapporteur, I'm advocating for member states and donors to commit to long-term support for civil society organizations, working either in or on Afghanistan, particularly women-led, flexible, multi-year and core funding to ensure that the organizations, that funding is available for organizations working on a diverse range of issues, including human rights documentation, protection, humanitarian assistance, education, especially for women and girls, health and service deliveries, legal assistance, demining, as well as those working in the media and in the arts. And to respect the autonomy of civil society organizations, ensuring that they lead in key areas of work and are setting priorities. I also want to mention, because I'm aware of this myself, that there are many Afghans, particularly women, in distress, often because of protesting or because they were working for different agencies, including security forces in the previous government, and they need protection. And sometimes they need to be brought to countries, different countries, to places of safety. And these are women also who are in Pakistan and Iran who are terrified of being deported back to Afghanistan. So I want to call on increased political support and financial support for this group. We have seen that drop off, and I really feel that it is life-saving work in many, many cases. So thank you, Frozan Jan. I will round up there and hand the floor back to you, but I really appreciate this opportunity and look forward to the discussion.
Raising the important challenges that has raised due to lack of funding, especially the challenge of protection. So thank you so much for all of your good speech. Now we will turn to Ms. Susan Ferguson from UN Women. You can see her background. She has extensive experience with UN Women in Afghanistan and on gender inequality issues Susan, as someone who is leading programs that support Afghanistan civil society organizations, how have women civil society organizations evolved in the last 4 years? And how deeply have they been affected by the funding cuts? What are your recommendations for ensuring their sustainability in the coming years? The floor is over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Farazan, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone here on the panel, and also in the audience. It's really an honor to be here, and like the fellow panelists before me, I just want to really acknowledge the very uncertain time here in Afghanistan with this sort of conflict between Pakistan, but also the ban on women, Afghan women coming to UN compounds, which is being enforced, the recent internet shutdown, which has also really affected especially women activists and women CSOs. So it is a very difficult time here in Afghanistan. And this is why we really need to keep alive, as I think Seema mentioned, this civic space for women through women-led CSOs. So I'm really pleased that I'm able to speak about this topic, because this is something that really gets to the heart of how UN Women tries to operate here in the country. Really, funding and support for women CSOs is very intentional within UN Women, and we really make sure that all of the groups that we fund are women-led or at least women-focused. And for UN Women, this is critical really for 3 reasons, and many have already been outlined by other panelists. But number 1 is that these organizations are one of the last remaining channels for Afghan women and girls to access services and support. In a context like Afghanistan, where women and girls do face these near total restrictions on their lives, women-led organizations are among the few actors still able to deliver trusted and sustainable solutions. Their locally led approach is absolutely critical. But, despite all the many overlapping constraints and restrictions, these groups continually find ways to navigate and overcome the barriers that they face. And number 2, these women-led organizations provide services by women for women. And it's, really grounded in that deep knowledge of local communities. And in a context where women are restricted from engaging with men, they must be able to access services and support from women, or they will fall through the cracks, as is evidenced clearly in humanitarian work. There really is no other option to provide principled support for women in Afghanistan. So number 3, these civil society organizations are really, as our previous panelists have said, under enormous stress. We really continue to stand with them and ensure that the groups that we're able to fund can keep the lights on. Unfortunately, we can't fund every group. Our funding also has been severely cut, but we are trying to maintain that space within our shrinking resources, really. Because once those civil society organizations are lost, it's very hard to regroup. It really is important to keep them alive. So to put simply, civil society organizations are really indispensable agents of change here. And we see our support of them not as a cost, but as an investment in the women of Afghanistan, their families and their communities. In recent years, we've supported more than 240 women-led organizations. And last year, we awarded close to $5 million in grants, and this year, a further $4 million. But much more is needed. That really is a drop in the bucket, and much more is needed. Overall, the funding situation, we are aware, for these organizations is extremely serious due to the aid cuts. Many projects targeting women and girls have closed down, impacting women's access to services, but also impacting women's ability to organize and discuss with each other what they want to push and raise with different stakeholders. So from a group of civil society partners we surveyed in July, more than 4 in 10 said they would have to lay off up to 30% of their women staff. 1/4 said they would have to lay off double that, about 60% of their women staff. And 4 in 10 organisations also said they could no longer pay the costs required for women to work there, such as maharam and transportation costs. These are really serious cuts. And of course, the consequences of these cuts are the loss of civic space for women. They also contribute to, over time, increases in child marriage, for example, or maternal death. As a previous speaker has said, the loss of health services is a huge, huge issue for women. But also it means that there are less protection services, and that has also been spoken about tonight. But as importantly, this space where women can raise their voices together and advocate needs and issues risk being silenced by this. So looking ahead, funding and sustainability, I really wish I could say that things would improve soon, but I do not think they will. I think, and Richard has really laid out some of the challenges there. But and in addition to the funding cuts, we're also seeing that many other restrictions and obstacles facing Afghanistan women are adding pressure on our civil society partners. So the operational impact is very real. This increased strain due to the escalating restrictions and being forced to temporarily halt operations to reassess risks and restructure program activities. Constantly, women CSOs are having to reinvent themselves to be able to continue operating. That's extremely difficult. And of course, the ever-present shadow of security concerns and surveillance by the DFA, and more recently, the internet and phone blackouts have all made life so much more difficult for women-led organisations who are still operating. So our recommendations really echo a number that have already been made. And they are, we need sustainable, flexible, quality funding for women's civil society operations. We've recommended many times 30% of all aid should be specifically focused on and for women, and the rest of it at least, clearly benefiting women. So we also think it's really crucial to maintain these inclusive and safe spaces for Afghan women to convene, share and organise themselves and engage in discussions about their own futures. And number 3, ensure actions don't inadvertently contribute or exacerbate normalisation or discriminatory DFA policies, norms and values. And number 4, embed human rights, especially women's rights, as a cross-cutting theme across all humanitarian action and basic human need interventions. And here I'm talking about the UN interventions, from the design to implementation and monitoring of all programs. And we certainly spent a lot of time in the UN system trying to ensure that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I really just also want to acknowledge the incredible women in Afghanistan who still fight for women's rights. And as the human rights activist has said, also really, despite the odds, choose resilience and strength. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for all those inputs. Our next speaker is Ms. Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, MBE, founder and CEO of ICANN. You can read her whole profile on the screen. Sanam, how do you evaluate the support provided to women CSOs in Afghanistan over the past 4 years, especially given the constraints, and how these organizations can become more creative and resilient? How can donors help sustain their efforts? We would be happy to have your reflections on this question. Thank you. The floor is yours, Suzanne. Sorry, Sanam.
Thank you, Firuzanjan. First of all, I want to thank the other speakers because I think they've been echoing everything that I would want to say. And my answer to your question is actually I would flip it, because what we see at ICANN is that our partners, our Afghan partners, are being asked to do the impossible task on a daily basis. And I would challenge any entity anywhere else in the world, frankly, whether it's at the UN, whether it's in England, America, or across the world, to survive and continue to work and sustain the resilience, as you spoke, the way Afghan women have done, given the circumstances that we have put them in. So this I think is just really, really important to highlight. At ICANN, so I'll give you some context. So prior to 2021, ICANN was supporting a number of Afghan women-led organizations. Our colleague Wajma and Nargis are amongst some of our partners and their organizations. We were supporting the work on the ground that they were doing, which was extraordinary and really important. And we were supporting the advocacy externally to say to our own governments that Afghan women should be heard, that their warnings should be heeded, that they should be involved in the negotiations and so forth. And as we all know, none of that happened, right? In fact, they were betrayed heavily. So then we ended up, as a small organization, trying to help people to safety and security to the extent that we could. Again, we were able to help about 1,000 people, maybe about 300 families affiliated with our network. A drop in the ocean compared to really what the dire need is. Meanwhile, our partners, and then we were trying to help women organizations inside the country, because of course you're not going to have everybody leaving, and you don't want everybody leaving. But what we found is that in the first couple of years, many governments were happy to provide resources. We had a grant from the UK government, which enabled us to help about 12 organizations and do mentoring, which reached thousands of women and women and men in different communities, all sorts of different work that was being done. We can share the reports with you. But that funding was incredibly restricted, number one, in terms of the type of work. So, the mandate was doing women's rights and conflict prevention. This is in 2022, when we've handed the keys to the Taliban, and now we're saying to women, hey, come along and do conflict prevention and peace building and women's rights, right? And when our partners were saying, well, we need to do livelihoods, we need to do mental health care, we need to do other forms of support to then enable women to have these voices, we had to talk to the donors to say, allow them the scope, and can we trust Afghan women to determine what is the best approach to the work. We should not be dictating to them what to do. We are investing in the trust that they have, and we should invest in their expertise. And if they say to us that livelihoods work is now the best avenue for enabling education or enabling violence prevention and mitigation of child marriage or radicalization of young boys into the Talibs, let's support that kind of work. And yet we consistently hear from different donors, oh, but that's a different pot. Oh, that's a different, sorry, the money that you have come is for this kind of work. And, oh, you want to do humanitarian work, that's a different pot. So my first recommendation would be that, my first point would be that our governments here in the West, who were part of the NATO alliance, have a responsibility to sustain and support Afghan women's well-being to the extent possible for as long as needed into the future. We have a responsibility because we betrayed them. That's number one. Number two is, I think that there should be a collective pool of funds made available for civil society activism on the ground, because those small organizations are much more agile, much more embedded. They know what people need, and they are doing the work themselves. And so why are we putting added burdens of reporting and dividing and siloing their lives when they already face so many restrictions on the ground? We should be enabling them to do the work that they want to do. And if they have creative designs of how they do livelihoods, mental health, and conflict prevention, that's fantastic. Go ahead and do it. If you have initiatives that want to engage with Talib leaders or religious leaders, go ahead. do it. If that comes together with, I don't know, humanitarian assistance work that they're doing, let them do it. But let them drive it, let it be locally led, and let us have the resources that we can channel to them in safe ways. So we need pools of funding available for sustained work. My third recommendation is that that funding needs to come from different sources. So it's great to have UN Women present and being able to do what they're able to do, but it's really important to have other entities like our mechanisms, the Innovative Peace Fund and ICANN, to also do it, because we provide a whole slew of support mechanisms for our partners. It's not just money and a grant that they have to. It's solidarity, it's advocacy support, it's organizational institutional support, it's mentoring for new activists that are coming in, it's connecting activists and young activists in Afghanistan with those in the diaspora, with others around the world. You need that community of practice, and that's something that an organization like ICANN can provide, because we work in a much more detailed and focused way. And it might be very difficult for UN Women to do that, because they're having to also deal with government and multilateral spaces. And then the final part of this is that we need much more coordination between all of us in our different sectors. So we need a strategy for how we engage on Afghanistan that brings UN Women with ICANN, with Wajma's organization, and the NGOs that are outside and the NGOs that are inside, with a vision of what is it that we want to create. What's Afghanistan and the situation for Afghan women going to look like in 5 years' time? What are we trying to avoid, and what are we trying to achieve? And there is an advocacy element. There's a legal dimension around, for example, gender apartheid. Is getting a recognition of gender apartheid an important step? But it's only a step. And what are the implications of that if that is achieved? How do we make sure that if you have gender apartheid recognized in Afghanistan, it doesn't inadvertently negatively impact women's organizations? Because in the past, when we've had apartheid designations, it's also meant sanctions. So we want carve-outs for sanctions for civil society. So you have to be very careful and coordinated around the top level advocacy that we're doing around recognition of, or lack of recognition of, the Taliban, the implications of sanctions, the implications of gender apartheid, and mitigating and stemming what the damage that the Taliban is doing, at the same time as thinking, what are the ways in which we actually enhance and provide opportunities and create an alternative vision for Afghanistan, where Afghan women can have a presence and can be their own advocates, can be their own activists, can be the drivers of their own life and their own destiny. And this takes time. I'm Iranian by background. When we had our revolution in 1979 and there was a pushback, the resistance and resilience of women stepped up straight away, as it's done with Afghan women. But we're 45 years in, and we still are having to fight a fight, because when the other side is willing to raise a club and a gun at you, and violence is their ticket, you have to have alternative ways of thinking about it. But what we're seeing in Iran is that Iranian women were able to preserve their right to vote. They secured their right to higher level education across all subjects, ultimately, even though they were trying to be prescribed. In terms of personal lives, marriage rights, all these things that Sharia law reduced our status as citizens, they have fought back, and they've been consistently doing this. And it's an ongoing struggle, but they have changed the culture from within and from bottom up. It's not a top down, it's not a westernized, and it is deeply embedded in Iranian society. And I think that there's a lot that Afghan women can benefit from that, but they need the help. They need to be recognized for what they're doing right now, and we need to make sure that they're connected with us internationally, and that we are helping them pursue those goals and create the spaces for them to be able to have that vision and the strategy and the implementation that's needed. We need to walk with them down this journey. So that I think is the way that we need to go forward. But I'm going to circle back and end by saying I challenge anyone anywhere in the world to have gone through what Afghan women have gone through in the last 4 or 5 years, and to have achieved what they have continued to achieve in these 4 or 5 years as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanam, for all your excellent input on the question that we asked. So we have a couple of questions here in the chat box. I would like to read them and then have your inputs. Whoever would like to share the inputs, they can go first. We have one question which is referred to Suzanne, and the question is, given these severe restrictions on women work, education, fundamental freedoms in Afghanistan, what is the United Nations, I mean by United Nations, they mean UN Women's practical and effective role in reversing those bans and suppression which the Afghan women are going on? So like what practical steps UN Women has taken, and what are the recommendations to change the situation? And the other question is, considering the current limitations, how can global donors and policymakers reimagine funding models that reach Afghan women directly and safely, ensuring long-term impact rather than short-term? We also just received some more questions in the chat box. Ananya, can you, I saw some more questions, but because everyone is writing, I think I lost them. Can you just read them?
Hello, Forzan John. We have a few more questions in the Q&A box,
Yeah.
which have been repeated from the chat. So let's go ahead and take them, because I think the
Yeah.
people writing in the chat
I
have
can
written them in the
see
Q&A.
Patoni Abidi. So we won't be able to take lots of questions because we just have 20 minutes. And if every speaker will speak for 3-4 minutes, so it will take time. So we will just take some questions that I just see. It's in front of me from Patoni Abidi. The question is, what happens to a society when half of its population is silenced? Okay, so it's more like a speech than questions. Okay, so if you can't see any more questions, Ananya, then should we go with these 2 questions for now?
There
Because
is
I can't
one
see
more
more
final
questions.
question that came latest from Sadaf Fakri. Given the current situation of Afghan women and the severe restrictions they face in accessing education, healthcare services, social participation, and basic freedoms, what effective and practical steps can the international community take to support and protect the fundamental rights of women in Afghanistan? I think many of our questions have come in on the same breath regarding the protection of women's rights and ensuring international communities' action. So we can go ahead with those for now.
Yeah. So let's first of all start with Suzanne, because one of the questions was directly for her. So let's first hear from her, and then 2 questions, they were general. So I would like to hear from each of the speakers very briefly for 2 minutes. They can provide their inputs. Thank you so much. So Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, I mean, this is about the bans on women and what are we doing. So, you know, this is one of a series of bans on women working, you know, bans against women working in NGOs and bans against women working for the UN. And there's been a number of times this year where Afghan women working for the UN have not been able to come to the compounds. But most recently, this is an escalation of the ban, with the Ministry of Defence kind of reinforcing that ban and not allowing women into the compounds. So there's been, you know, we as UN Women, we can't operate alone in this kind of thing. So the UN itself has been making representations to the DFA, requesting this ban to be reversed. We need some sort of durable solution to this, because we're able, much like women's civil society organizations in Afghanistan, we're able to kind of reinvent ourselves somewhat and work out workarounds for a while, but we really need it reversed. And the UN alone cannot do that. We would really ideally like member states, especially those regional member states, to be able to also go into, as we say in Australia, bat for us We want them to, they really need to, we're hoping that they will also, call on the DFA to reverse the bans. In the meantime, we're doing a whole range of things. I mean, women are still working. In UN Women, the majority of our staff are women, Afghan women. So this ban is a particular issue for us and for our ability to deliver our work. So, we have a package of support for women working from home, including solar panels and decent data and things like that, so that they can continue to work online. And we're also looking at because women can still work in the field, not coming to the office, but being able to work, for example, in the earthquake site, they're able to do that. So we're looking at, can we surge some of our women to these sites where they can still work with others? Because, of course, it's not just the restrictions on being able to work because you're behind a computer, it's just not as effective in some of the work that we're doing. But really, it's just so important for people to have a sense of community. And this has really impacted on women's sense of isolation. And I think it was maybe Seymour or someone who was talking about this, house arrest feeling. So we're really looking at how can we try and provide collegial support for women. So we're meeting women outside the office where we can, where it's safe, where it's under the radar. There's a range of different things we're doing to try and keep afloat women's ability to continue to work for other women in Afghanistan. So while we continue to lobby and advocate for the bans to be lifted.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for your response. And now I would also like to hear from the rest of our speakers on the two other questions. I hope you have noted down the questions. So I would like to start from Richard. I would like the responses to be very brief, like 2 minutes, so we can finish on time. The floor is yours, Richard.
Yeah,
if you
thank
would
you,
like
Frozan.
to...
Actually, I had, before you spoke, I'd also written a reply to one of the questions about the UN, actually. And there are a couple of things that, I agree completely with Suzanne, that it's utterly unacceptable for any member state to dictate to the UN who can work for them and who can come to their compounds, especially on the grounds of gender. And the member states, and when we talk about the UN, I think it's always useful to clarify, what is the UN? The UN is, what the policymakers in the UN are the members of the UN, the states. And largely the what we call the agencies, funds and programs are, they have a very important role, but they are carrying out to some degree political directions, and especially they're restricted by the amount of resources they have. And so I've worked a lot in different countries for the UN, including Afghanistan, and there's quite a lot you can do on the ground, but you really need, and as Suzanne used the term, you need the member states going into bat for you. That's a cricket term, and Afghans are no cricket these days, so just as well as Australians and New Zealanders. And so I think this is super important. The other thing is, I mentioned in the chat, is that there has been little bits of good news in terms of UN action. Last week in the Human Rights Council, the UN, there was a resolution on Afghanistan, which one thing it did was renew my own mandate, but more importantly, it established an independent investigative mechanism. This is a mechanism that will help hold to account those responsible for all these serious crimes and violations. It will take time, but it is more than talk. It will not deliver services. That's the thing. The mechanism was called for by many Afghans, and the international community in the presence of the Human Rights Council did react to that call, actually against the tide, because under the UN's pressure the UN is under at the moment, new mechanisms are discouraged and unlikely. But anyway, they decide to do this, to strengthen and support particularly Afghan women and girls. But it does not deliver the kind of support and services on a day-to-day basis that are needed to improve the lives of Afghan women and girls. It requires an all tools approach. It may have a slight deterrent effect because the Taliban and any others need to know that they're being watched, it's being documented, and they could end up in court. So I think that's positive, but much, much more needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your response. And we have two more questions. So the next speakers, when you will be speaking, we would also like to hear your response to these two new questions, which is, how can international organizations ensure that justice and recognition for past atrocities are not forgotten in current women's rights and funding discussions? And the other question by Jasmine is, what can organizations do beyond providing grants, like to create long-term partnerships with grassroots organizations and create equitable pathways and strengthen local capacity, particularly in countries where access to resources is restrictive? So what are your responses to these questions apart from the others which is already shared? So can we now hear from Wajmajan, if we can hear from you very briefly, like around 2 minutes?
Sure, thank you. I want to also mention the question that was raised by Dylan about Canada, what Canada can do, you know, in terms of supporting the women-led organizations. So as you can see, and I think everybody sees in the chat as well, that all the questions are about the UN, like all the focus is about the UN. And why is that? Because, you know, the international aid does not come directly to women organizations or even not a lot to international organizations, but UN agencies are receiving that funding from the member states and international donors. So there's a lot of focus on that, but at the same time, there's also this continuous need-based funding. So that is also a major challenge, that what we get on the ground is not what is needs-based. It already has a very specific, you know, agenda that what we are hearing from people on the ground and women, that there are very basic needs. So that needs-based, you know, funding is very much critical. And the second thing is also about simplifying the processes. You know, the processes that women-led organization and women-led initiatives can actually get the funding. So, for example, we have been told by an UN agency that you need to have a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, with one of the ministries in order to be able to get the funding. So imagine if we have, you know, criteria as such, that makes the work of women organizations and women-led initiatives completely impossible, because that's a huge risk for them to go to, you know, the Taliban and ask them for a permission letter or for an MOU. So, you know, that because there's pressure on the UN. And the last thing I want to also mention is about what is also happening. You know that there is AHF funding that's going on. There's a twinning. I'm sure Susan might have heard about the twinning project that, you know, Akbar is managing. Like, see how many women organizations are getting that. Maybe we need to double that so that women organizations can actually receive from, you know, those immediate support that, like, for example, AHF and twinning has. Thank you.
Thank you, Wajmajan. Seemajan, would you also like to provide your inputs on those questions, if there is something which is not discussed?
I have a couple of sort of general comments, and I'm sort of, you know, what I'm probably addressing more on behalf of the Afghan women inside the country and some of the comments, and more towards our international participants. And, you know, hopefully through our international participants in this meeting, to, you know, bigger community of the international aid agency. I think there is a, you know, for 4 years, we've been talking about localization, and, you know, people like myself, including me, you know, talking to donors, to agencies that are working on sort of aid, funding, support, localized, and that makes it easier. I think there's a misinterpretation of localization. Some of the UN agencies and international NGOs who are no longer able or allowed by Taliban to be the implementing bodies, they have to contract local NGOs, and they think that's localization. And therefore, what they do is to subcontract or give their projects for implementation purposes to large male-dominated organizations to implement. What they don't do is put benchmarks or check, okay, maybe the head of the NGO is man, but how about the senior level? Are there women employed at senior level in those NGOs? No. I did a study at the end of last year, and any of those major NGOs I went to see, I was faced by men sitting across, from me on the other side of the table. I didn't come across a single woman. I had to ask them, do you have female staff? Because I want to talk to them as well. So this is kind of, this, I think probably, UN Women is probably the only organization that's actually working with UN female NGOs, women-led or more women at the top layers. That has to be interpreted. The other issue is that due to pressures from the Taliban, a lot of agencies are also subcontracting Taliban NGOs. The last 4 years saw a large number of NGOs being set up, all by Taliban, a large number of companies set up by Taliban. They're pressurizing, and the donor community finds it easier to work with them. So they say, okay, I think we should not forget the Paris, principles, Paris Declaration principles, do no harm. Let's not forget, do no harm, do no harm. We have to keep repeating, they're actually doing harm in the country by subcontracting those NGOs that are, and I don't actually know the numbers, but I know there are hundreds and hundreds. One other point, which is sort of, not directly related to this one, but more to the women talking about, supporting women. How do we support them? Let's think of a young woman who is probably about 16, 17 years old. The last 4 years, what happened to her? She could not go to school. She was not lucky enough to have money to study online. Her family felt it was easier to marry her off, so she got married. Unless they're married, above 18, I would call it child marriage. Even if at 17, they're children. Today's, I think, we used to get mature earlier in the old days, but today's kids are really kids. What happens to that young woman? She hasn't finished school. She's getting married. She's going to have children. And those children, if boys, they go to school. Where do they study? In a madrasa. How is this woman, a mother, is supposed to take care of the kids if she hasn't been through any training, any of those life skills or whatever else we're talking about? I think we need to prepare ourselves to start helping and supporting the young women, more and more the young women, to prepare them to manage those madrasa-going children, because they're brainwashed. Girls are going to madrasas now because they want to go somewhere for education. And unfortunately, they're being brainwashed there. So whatever we do, it's like what a couple of our friends were saying earlier. There's a group of women that are not just ordinary survivors. They don't call them victims. They're resilient. They're active. They want to learn. They want to do things. They want to go out there and train others and talk to others. Let's support them to support those other younger women who don't have access to anything, so that we are not losing a whole generation. Now it's 4 years, it's going to continue. Of course, we're not expecting UN to bring, its forces, or if there are forces in the country, I don't think, there's going to be any military action inside the country. Therefore, we have to somehow, while we are doing advocacy and everything else, we have to think of the current youth. What are we doing with them? Thank you.
Thank you for all those comprehensive responses, Seema Jan. And now, last not the least, Sanam Jan, we would go to you to hear your response to all these discussions and the questions that we heard.
Thank you. As I said earlier, I think that it's time to, number one, to be calling for a sort of a long-term pool of funding for Afghan civil society, so that we're not lurching from one-year programs to one-year programs. We spent, somebody had asked about the ICANN program. We spent about 18 months negotiating with the donor around what we could do and what we could support and so forth. We start the program. It was meant to be about, ended up being a 2-year program of work instead of being 3 years or 4 years. And then as the work was going on, and we reached the end of the time frame, the funding was, it's the program wasn't renewed, not because the work that we were doing wasn't good. They loved what the results were and what was happening on the ground. It was because their priorities changed and policies have changed and, their overall funding cuts. So there's a real lack of consistency from the donor base that we're seeing. But if there was a willingness to have a pool of funds that could be dispersed agilely and effectively over time, it would be far less wastage, frankly, and far more effective and safer. This is the other thing, because some of the restrictions that they put on international organizations means that sums of money are being transferred that can make it very dangerous for local organizations. So we end up having to navigate and negotiate with donors to say, allow us to do smaller transfers of funding over longer periods of time, but they don't make our lives easier. So I think that these kinds of things need to be thought through, and whether it's Canada, whether it's the UK, but some pooling funds is important. The other thing that I just wanted, the other model of work that we put into place during for 2 years was that we recognized that there were many Afghan women who had been professionals prior to 20, obviously trained as lawyers, teachers, doctors, etc., that were now stuck at home and wanted to do something. So we had an online mentoring program for a number, and in the time frame that we had, which was quite short, we did a cohort of about 50 women. 26 of them continued to do work, and they took the skills that they had before. They took the mentoring that they received from Afghans outside and from others outside around how you organize and mobilize. And they ended up doing their own initiatives in their own communities around livelihoods, around mental health, and around so they became kind of social entrepreneurs in their own spaces without necessarily having to set up an organization or going through the rigmarole of bureaucracy. They were just doing it. I think that's a really important model as well, because you have so much talent and so much skill and expertise sitting at home. So how do we harness that, and how do we give people, for some it was just the encouragement of saying, hey, you can do something. Don't, so I think, again, with a few resources, you can leverage that kind of assistance and support and connectivity to the outside world. Similarly with education, I know there are lots of different education initiatives going on around, from remote education and so forth. Those kinds of things need to be continued precisely because we've had 4 years where girls haven't gone to school. I want to add one other aspect to this, and I think somebody alluded to it earlier. It's not just about girls not going to school. It's about boys going to school and learning from a pretty radical curriculum right now. And this is the part that we also need to bring to international attention, because if in the past there was the number of boys that were ending up recruited into Taliban schools and madrasas and being sort of ideologically brainwashed was in the thousands, now it's in the millions. And nobody's paying much attention to these poor boys, what's happening to them, but also what then that means at home. And one of the big dangers is that even if we have full-on education for girls at home remotely, and they're learning a certain set of values and skills and attitudes, and the boys are learning something else, it's still going to create a clash. So you need to provide the resources so that people can actually give their boys the kind of education to change their mentality. And time goes by fast. Imagine a 10-year-old boy right now. If there was an effort to educate and get them to understand issues of respect and equality and prevention of violence and how you deal with issues of conflict, etc., without using violence, in 10 years' time, that 10-year-old boy is going to be 20 years old. They will themselves not want to participate in Taliban-style ideological movements. They will themselves be part of the resistance. So I think that's also a strategy to be thinking about. And in terms of again, our experience prior to 2021 was we supported one of our partners who was working with men in her communities. She was working with imams and district chiefs and teachers and so forth. And those men, once they were engaged and were given the opportunity to actually think about what it means to live in peace and live without violence and resolve differences and be protective of each other and of their families and so forth, became champions, both for women, but also for children. They are still there. So there's huge talent and potential out in Afghanistan. And the between the economic sanctions that are on the country and the lack of funding that is being channeled, or the reduction of funding, we're completely destroying it's not even potential, it's the reality that sits there that could make things different. So it comes back to resources and political will, I think, but we shouldn't, we really need to think about it holistically. And even if from the Western perspective, international community's perspective, we think about it very selfishly, you don't want a generation being educated, a generation of young boys and men being educated into radicalization. It's bad for Afghanistan, it's bad for the region, and it's bad for the world. So we have a responsibility to address that as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sanam, for all those information. And now we have reached the end of the panel discussion, so we would like to conclude. Thank you so much to all panelists for the fruitful discussion and for your very clear message that the world must not abandon Afghan women defenders or the organizations that sustain them. Now, I would like to give the floor to Wajma Jan for wrapping up the webinar and providing her remarks.
Thank you so much. And I can see that we are reaching the end of our time here, but it's amazing to hear, you know, the resilience that we keep talking about. I have been reading the messages from women from inside Afghanistan, and it just gives me so much energy to keep doing what we are doing and also to keep supporting them. But something that came very, very strong from this conversation is that support the women of Afghanistan inside Afghanistan so that they can help other women. That is a very big message for, you know, all of us. And no matter how much we, you know, do outside Afghanistan, if we do not create that space for women on the ground, we would not be making any progress or impact. And that's you know, a lesson learned for all of us, and that's what we have learned from other countries. You know, the change does not come from outside, the change comes from within. So the pool of funding that Sana mentioned, and that's something that women have been talking about. We need at least 30% of the funding, the international funding that comes, you know, earmarked for women-led initiatives. And I'm also want to mention that women-focused organization is also another term that many male organizations are using in Afghanistan, because they think, okay, we are doing something for women, maybe that's how we would get funding. So women-led initiatives and women-led organizations it should be actually recognized for who they are and the struggles they are, and they need to get that, not just that pool of funding, but simplification of the process as well. And you know, there are international legal protections for that. We have the UNSCR 2615, which provides, you know, legal protection for the donors to provide funding to women-led organizations. We also have OFAC licenses that actually supports that. So there is a legal protection for many people who think that it's not possible to support women-led initiatives. It is possible. And the last thing I want to mention is that organizations who work on education, many of the women are telling us that we cannot join the online classes. We cannot do this because we do not have the internet. We do not have the access to buying it, as well as, you know, the devices that are needed. So education cannot be just, you know, summarized by providing people with online education. They need stipend, they need support, they need the communication devices as well. And there is a cheaper way to do that. Why not provide that funding to a local group to do that on their own? They will find the alternative mechanisms. They will find the ways that can be done safely. So thank you so much, Frozan Jan, and that's it.
Thank you so much, Wajma Jan. We have reached the end of the webinar. To conclude the webinar, I would now like to invite Ms. Seema Ghani to deliver the closing remarks and highlight the key action points from today's discussion. Seema Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frozan Jan. I think, you know, everybody said everything that needed to be said. It's very promising to know that inside Afghanistan, we are not alone, that young women are still standing tall and still, we're hearing from an early, someone in their early 20s earlier, and of course, everywhere to say, do not give up hope, that we are hopeful, that we are strong, that we're not just victims, that we're not just ordinary survivors. We continue fighting and we're not going to give up. That's really important. And it's also very important to hear our international partners that they're not giving up, no matter what happens, no matter if, Taliban have shut the doors on women to enter UNOCA or wherever else, that, you're standing with us, the international partners. It's promising to know that the advocacy is going to continue between, us, Afghans inside Afghanistan, outside Afghanistan, and the international partners. And the message was very clear to say, please do not give up on us, that there will be change. I think no government in Afghanistan, at least, and I can, talk about Afghanistan, no government has ever lost it forever. It's going to change. I don't think there's a very long future for Taliban, and that's really important. And these messages have to be delivered to inside Afghanistan. It's very important for Afghan women inside Afghanistan, even Afghan men, to know that they're not left alone, that people haven't forgotten them, that we're continuing doing whatever we can, whatever possible, with whatever means we have, even if it's little, to give people hope to continue believing and standing tall. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seema Jan. So with this, we are closing the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, the panelists, the participants, the organizers. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very
Susan,
much.
John, for your
everyone.
management. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Bye-bye. You too.
Okay.